and ultimately to invest in a way that enables us to create a more successful, prosperous Scotland. And I would have thought that's something members on all sides of the chamber would support.
Thank you. Before we move to the next item of business, members will wish to join me in welcoming to the gallery His Excellency Dr Dominic Furgler, the Ambassador of Switzerland. We now move to First Minister's questions. As the Parliament agreed yesterday that a member other than Johann Lamont could ask question number 1, today I call Jackie Baillie to do so.
To ask the First Minister what engagements he has planned for the rest of the day.
First Minister.
Engagements to take forward the Government's programme for Scotland. In light of Johann Lamont's absence, can I say that about career and life of Tony Benn, he was not just a substantial parliamentarian, but also a great campaigner and writer, and he'll be much missed by his family, obviously, but also by his many friends across the political spectrum.
Ms Baillie.
Can I thank the First Minister for his generous comments, which we on this side of the chamber share. The First Minister and his deputy refused to back Labour's plans for an energy price freeze to help hard-pressed families cope with rising bills. Indeed, his very own Energy Minister, Fergus Ewing, said a price freeze would be completely unworkable and lead to blackouts. Now that SSE have agreed a price freeze and Ofgem are reviewing the way the entire energy industry charges consumers, will the First Minister now admit that Labour was right and he and his ministers were wrong?
First Minister.
Well, Jackie Baillie omitted to mention in her declaration of "We was right" that the SNP proposed a £70 cut in family energy bills, which by definition is rather better than freezing energy bills. Can I welcome the monopoly investigation and competition investigation into the energy market? I think that's a far more sustainable way to look at these matters and ensure that families are protected than other suggestions that have been made. I also think that such a review on competition must look at the entire energy market in terms of production, and in particular should look at the contract recently offered in nuclear generation and the impact that will have potentially on household bills over the next 30 years.
Jackie Baillie.
The SNP's proposal would save companies money and load the cost onto the taxpayers. Labour's proposals would deliver a higher saving, and it would be a saving for ordinary people instead of increasing the profit of the big 6 energy companies. That's the difference. From the beginning of this debate, the First Minister has been on the side of the energy companies rather than the side of ordinary Scots struggling to pay their bills. He has stood shoulder to shoulder with David Cameron, saying you can't freeze prices, the market doesn't need reform. And the big 6 energy companies...
Order!
The big...
Order!
Do you know they make a lot of noise, presiding officer? The big 6 energy companies have made an obscene £867 million in profit while families struggle. Of course, those profits would be even higher after a yes vote because of the First Minister's corporation tax cuts. As SSE announce a price freeze and Ofgem announce plans to reform the market, let me give the First Minister another chance to answer the question. Will he now admit he was wrong not to back Labour's proposals?
First Minister.
Even for Jackie Baillie, the shoulder-to-shoulder remark the morning after the night before, when Labour MPs marched through the Tory lobby just yesterday in the House of Commons, shoulder to shoulder. Can I say to Jackie Baillie, when you're in a campaign, a Better Together campaign, not just shoulder to shoulder, but hand in glove, umbilically linked to the Conservative Party, it's not the best idea to come along to this chamber and try and associate people with guilt by the Conservative Party. The Labour Party are an extension of the Conservative Party.
Order.
Now, £70 of household bills may be irrelevant to Jackie Baillie and to the Labour Party. It will be greatly welcomed by families in Scotland as a substantial proposal. The review and competition in the electricity markets is welcome. That offers the opportunity to fully examine the marketplace. And I hope and believe that the Labour Party will see the sense of extending that review to nuclear power and the contract that's been offered to Hinkley Point, for the very obvious reason that if you continue your support for that contract, a contract at double the current wholesale price for electricity, then there would only be one direction for electricity bills in the future, and that is upwards. So let's have a review and a competition examination, examining the conduct of the big 6 electricity companies and also the huge nuclear subsidy, which is overwhelming, threateningly, electricity bills in this country.
Jackie Baillie.
Presiding Officer, what that just demonstrated is it actually doesn't matter who asks the questions. The First Minister still doesn't answer. Can I also remind him, because he's clearly suffering from amnesia, that he himself is at odds with his deputy and his MPs because he supports a cap on benefits. At least he told the Sunday Post so. But of course, the First Minister's White Paper proposes weaker regulation of the energy companies than we have just now. Labour legislated to abolish fuel poverty by 2016, but on his watch, the number of households in fuel poverty has reached an all-time high of 900,000. The fuel poverty budget is underspent, and installers are going to the wall. And instead of plans to help these 900,000 households struggling to heat their homes, he plans a huge tax cut for the big 6 companies who are ripping Scottish families off. As ever with the First Minister, big business comes first and real Scots are at the end of the queue. For the third time of asking, Presiding Officer, as SSE freeze prices and Ofgem announce they will reform the market, surely the First Minister, even he, has the humility to admit Labour was right and he was wrong.
First Minister.
It doesn't matter who's asking the questions because you're reading from the same script week by week. We don't support. Well, we were all waiting with bated breath to see who would be the chosen one, the next leader apparent. There were so many candidates in the back benches. The reason that the Labour Party are in trouble in Scotland is the association with the Conservatives in better together, and the script doesn't change from week to week. So for the third time, we support the competition review into the electricity industry and gives a sustainable way to protect the consumer. We support the £70 reduction in electricity bills that we proposed, which by definition most people would understand is rather better than a freeze in electricity bills. We think that is the right way to proceed. And we also understand that if you offer a couple of companies a contract at Hinkley Point at double the wholesale price of electricity, then that means the direction of electricity bills under Labour is going upwards if they continue that support for nuclear power. And in supporting that monopolies review into the current Big Six structure of the electricity industry, which requires examination, let us just reflect on who was the architect of that current structure. By goodness me, it wasn't David Miliband, it was Ed Miliband.
Jackie Baillie.
Presiding Officer, we operate in the UK energy market. We get a third of the overall UK budget for renewables, despite our population share being 1/10. Independence would remove that. independence would cost an extra £875 per year for each household to make up the renewable shortfall. That's the price of independence on families already struggling to pay their bills. Do you know, Presiding Officer, in all of that, I didn't hear an apology from the First Minister. When Ed Miliband called for the price freeze 6 months ago, this government's energy spokesperson, Fergus Ewing, said, "Never has a measure introduced by a leader of a major political party in the UK received such widespread, utter and total condemnation as being unworkable." Well, now that Labour's policy has been adopted by one of our major energy companies, now that Ofgem are following Labour's lead, will the First Minister finally admit he was wrong and he has let down families struggling with gas and electricity bills, or is sorry simply the First Minister's hardest word?
Everybody is following Labour's lead. The Conservative Party, SSE, everybody is following Labour's lead. Unfortunately, what SSE said yesterday about Labour's proposals is they would not significantly reduce energy prices or provide energy investors with the long-term quality they require to invest in the energy infrastructure that consumers depend on. Now, if Jackie Bailey's interpretation is that SSE are following Labour's lead, then she has got some considerable explaining to do. Now, this question of the umbilical link between Labour and the Conservatives. Well, this was Jackie Bailey's first point. This was the shoulder-to-shoulder point. Then why on earth, how far does this link go through society? I have here the Argyll and Bute Conservative Party website, the Cowell Conservative Lunch Club, venue Argyll Hotel, Secretary Pamela Bellaby, lunch, tea and coffee £10, Speaker Jackie Bailey, MST. I've heard of shoulder to shoulder, but I tell the Labour Party, if you sup with the Tories, you should do it with a long spoon.
Question number 2. Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister when he'll next meet the Prime Minister.
First Minister.
No plans, near future.
Ruth Davidson.
Domestic violence is a huge problem which affects all societies, including Scotland. Last year, a disclosure scheme allowing individuals to contact the police to find out if their partners have a previous history of abuse was piloted across 4 areas of England and Wales. It's been called Clare's Law, after 36-year-old Clare Wood, who was killed by an ex-partner who had already been jailed twice for violence against women. In May, the First Minister promised to examine the pilots. In September, the Justice Secretary wrote to police officers saying he would consider supporting Clare's Law in Scotland if the pilots were a success. Can I ask the First Minister what assessment the Scottish Government has made of these pilot projects?
First Minister.
Well, as the correspondence from the Justice Secretary indicated, the matter is indeed under assessment. We will take it seriously. We are taking it seriously. I know that Ruth Davidson, when we last discussed this issue, was generous enough to indicate her support for the variety of initiatives in tackling domestic violence. And we had an exchange about our disagreement in terms of the general rule of corroboration, which I hope she will reconsider, given the impact that has on bringing many cases to court. It's not just crimes of sexual violence, but also domestic violence, which are one of the issues in that discussion. But we will and are considering whether this can be extended to Scotland, and we will do whatever we can to ensure that people in Scotland, women in Scotland, are as safe as they possibly can be in the home environment and outside the home environment.
Ruth Davidson.
I thank the First Minister for that answer. I appreciate that he says assessments are still going on by the Scottish Government, but I think it is clear from the results that the 4 pilots have produced that they were a success. In fact, nearly a third of all applications saw relevant information being disclosed. And from this month, Clare's Law will now be rolled out across the whole of England and Wales. It means that women and men, fearful that their partners may have a history of domestic violence, have the right to access vital information which could save them from abuse. And that same right would be of benefit to Scotland. Our police and criminal justice services do a difficult and sensitive job extremely well in dealing with 60,000 cases of domestic abuse in this country every single year. 1 in 5 women in Scotland will experience domestic abuse at some stage of their lives, and nearly a third of all people convicted of domestic violence in Scotland have at least one previous domestic abuse conviction. They've done it before and they're doing it now, and women have that right to know. A Scottish Clare's Law would give them that right. This has worked elsewhere, and it could work here. Will the First Minister please commit to acting now to give people across Scotland the rights and protections that they desperately need?
First Minister.
I could go through the range of initiatives that this government have taken in domestic violence. And I won't do that because these are agreed initiatives, and these are things that are supported by the entire Parliament, including the range of support to organisations working in the field, which is deeply appreciated. I could read out a range of quotes from these organisations in terms of the support they have from the Justice Secretary, from this government and indeed across this Parliament. I've said to Ruth Davidson that we are studying the matter. She will recall that when a similar disclosure idea in terms of sexual offences was put forward some years ago after pilots elsewhere, we introduced that or a comparable situation in Scotland. We are always willing to learn lessons from experience which is working. So when I say to her this matter is under active consideration, it is under active consideration, and if it can be justified and if it will improve the position of women in Scotland, then just as we've arranged and introduced that range of measures which I've mentioned, then so we'll look at this very seriously and positively. And if it can work and will improve the lot of women, then we would introduce it.
Question number 3, Willie Rennie.
To ask the First Minister what issues will be discussed at the next meeting of the Cabinet.
First Minister.
Issues of importance to the people of Scotland.
Willie Rennie.
When I last asked the First Minister about the extensive use of stop and search, including on children under the age of 10, he told me he was comfortable and satisfied. Crime levels, he said, justified the action. What evidence does he have that record low levels of crime, which we have seen right across the Western world, are down to his stop and search policy?
First Minister.
The fact that some 20% of the stop and searches yield a result in terms of either carrying of alcohol for people underage or alternatively for offensive weapons would be a strong indication that the policy has a merit. Secondly, I would point, Willie Rennie, in particular to the sharp decline in the carrying of knives in Scotland and the consequential, very substantial fall in the injuries and indeed serious injuries and worse as a cause of the use of knives. Now, it was a debate just a year or two ago about how you tackle such a thing through the penal code or indeed through police enforcement. And our argument was police enforcement to make people not just safe but feel safe was one of the critical moves that could be made in terms of approaching that. I would say to Willie Rennie, looking at these figures, that approach seems to be vindicated by the very encouraging reductions in both the carrying and use of knives in Scottish society, something which I know will be welcomed across this chamber.
Question number 4. Sorry, Mr. Rennie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm disappointed with the answer because that's the same kind of casual and complacent response that the Justice Secretary gave this week. I'll explain why this is a matter that the First Minister should be concerned about. Aberdeen Youth Council passed a motion on Tuesday to express serious concern about the excessive use of stop and search on young people. The Human Rights Commission have voiced concerns, and those concerns were echoed by his own MSP, Sandra White. He's allowed stop and search to increase fourfold on his watch, and he says he's comfortable and satisfied with that. I think the First Minister should be concerned. Protecting people's freedoms is a matter for him. Is he going to take any responsibility for this?
First Minister.
I don't think there was anything casual about the reply I gave to Willie Rennie. Can I tell him specifically crimes of handling offensive weapons are down by 60% since 2006-07. At 4,000 in 2012-13 compared with 10,110 in 2006-07. In terms of people's freedoms, I think one thing is hugely important. That's the freedom from fear that many, many young people had when they believed, wrongly, but they still believed that their safety was going to be enhanced by the carrying of knives. The figures I've given Willie Rennie, and I tell him in all seriousness, is real freedom. That's the freedom from fear of being injured and killed as a result of offensive weapons being carried. And I hope that Willie Rennie will treat these statistics with the same seriousness that he's asked me to treat his questions.
We now come to question number 4, James Dornan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Again, to ask the First Minister how much money has been seized and reinvested across communities under the proceeds of crime legislation since 2007.
Well, there's no doubt that the Proceeds of Crime Act is having a real impact on how Scotland's prosecutors and police tackle criminality at every level. Since the legislation was introduced 10 years ago, over £80 million worth of assets have been seized. We are not yet at the end of this financial year, but the Solicitor General will, as in previous years, announce the final figures in April. Since Cashback for Communities began, over £74 million recovered from the proceeds of crime has been invested or committed through Scotland, which has funded 1.2 million activities and opportunities for young people across the country.
James Dornan.
I thank the First Minister for that answer. It's clear that Cashback for Communities has benefited the people of Scotland greatly and will continue to do so. But does the First Minister agree with me that if the money from fines paid to the Scottish Court Service were to remain in Scotland, this would give the Scottish Government greater access to funds which could be reinvested across local communities throughout Scotland, including my constituency of Cathcart, instead of being lost in the maw of the Westminster Treasury?
First Minister.
Well, obviously, it depends on the amount of fines, and that's itself dependent on a range of variables, crime rate, sentencing policy of the courts. However, on the basis of income and transfers in 2009 to 2012, as we set out in Scotland's future, that retention of the full value of Scotland's fines income would provide approximately £7 million per year in additional income to invest in our communities. One of many, many arguments for having control of Scotland's finances.
Patricia Fergus.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I know that the First Minister believes, as I do, in the transformational power of sport and the opportunities it gives us to help to divert young people from crime. Can I ask him, therefore, whether he would consider ensuring that those communities most blighted by crime are given special consideration when cashback monies are disbursed?
First Minister.
Well, we'll certainly look at any proposals that the member comes forward with. But I think, and I've got a long list covering every constituency and area in this chamber of how Cashback for Communities has benefited many fine projects. And I'm sure that Patricia Ferguson would not want to argue that any one of these excellent initiatives, and I can go through them, Labour MSP by Labour MSP in area if we wish, I know that Patricia Ferguson wouldn't argue that these haven't been vital and valuable projects that have been supported by Cashback for Communities. And therefore, I know that this initiative, whatever bickering there might be in the Labour backbenches, I know that this initiative has the support of every member in this chamber because it's benefiting the lives and livelihoods of young people across Scotland.
Question 5, Iain Gray.
To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government position is on BlackRock's warning to investors of the risks faced by an independent Scotland.
First Minister.
Well, a range of companies, and I shall name some of them, as Iain Gray wishes, have assessed Scotland's prospects. But serious analysis of Scotland's prospects would conclude, I think, that Scotland is a developed European economy, the 14th most prosperous country in the world in terms of GDP per head, and offers a serious investment and development opportunity for companies who are willing and able to share in that future. I think that's what's happening now with the record business confidence, the lower unemployment figures in the UK, the higher employment figures in the UK, and business expansion reaching, as we saw in a survey just this week, a record high. And I know that Iain Gray welcomes all these things, although he didn't forecast them when he was leader of the Labour Party.
Iain Gray.
Presiding Officer, there was a time when this First Minister acted on warnings about the Scottish economy and Scottish jobs. Back in 2008, when the Scottish banking sector was threatened, he immediately called an emergency summit to see what could be done, and rightly so. And I remember when we heard warnings about Scottish shipbuilding jobs being under threat, we went together to Whitehall to argue for them, and we won. But now the First Minister has no time for warnings which tell him what he does not want to hear, not just from BlackRock, but from BAE, BP, Shell, Weir, Standard Life, RBS, and I could go on. All warnings met with casual dismissal. Mr. Gray? Isn't that because he is the threat to Scottish jobs they're all warning about?
First Minister.
All these years away from First Minister's questions, and the script hasn't changed at all. If only Iain Gray had had the opportunity to ask 4 questions, we could have had doom and gloom throughout 4 periods. Can I read him one quotation, which I know that he doesn't like, because I heard him dismiss it on radio just a couple of days ago. And of course it's from Standard & Poor's. Even excluding North Sea output and calculating per capita GDP only by looking at onshore income, Scotland would qualify for our highest economic assessment. Now, can I say to Iain Gray that rating agencies are not known as the most optimistic people in the face of the planet? Some of them are even more pessimistic than Iain Gray. But if Standard & Poor's can bring themselves to state that considerable confidence in Scotland's future, why on earth can't it be shared by the Labour Party?
Christina McKelvey, briefly.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Does the First Minister agree that the uncertainty that the Better Together folk crow about could be removed by constructive discussions with Westminster on currency union and many, many other matters, which is in everyone's interest, following on from the report from Professor Leslie Young describing the UK Government's stance as entirely a false argument?
First Minister.
Well, I'm glad the member mentioned Professor Young, because he was also dismissed by Iain Gray on the radio as telling a few inconvenient truths in terms of his analysis of the Treasury and the Better Together position. And I note from the Times newspaper this very morning, not a paper which is known to be thorough to the independence cause in Scotland as of late, that they have examined that people in Scotland believe that George Osborne is bluffing on the currency by a substantial majority. Also say that fresh poll piles pressure on Labour as SNP extend its lead. What is more interesting is why Labour are in that position of great difficulty. And I don't think it's just an unholy alliance shoulder to shoulder with the Conservative Party. I think it's people who talk down this country's prospects will be rejected by the Scottish people.
Question number 6, Patrick Harvie. Mr. Harvie.
To ask the First Minister what role a constitutional convention would play in developing a written constitution in an independent Scotland.
First Minister.
Well, as set out in Scotland's future, the first independent parliament elected in May 2016 would be under a duty to establish a constitutional convention. That convention would prepare a permanent written constitution for an independent Scotland through an open, participative and people-led process. The constitution would be designed by the people of Scotland for the people of Scotland, and having a written constitution, of course, would bring us into line with just about every developed democracy, certainly in the European Union and indeed across the Commonwealth of Nations.
Patrick Harvie.
I believe the referendum has the potential to engage and reconnect many people who felt disillusioned about politics and disconnected. They've not been voting. We've got the chance to bring them back into the political process. Indeed, I think that's already happening. But surely there's a need to maintain that momentum, to capture that enthusiasm from day one after a referendum and achieve, as Nicola Sturgeon said, an inclusive process involving all the people of Scotland in all aspects of the transition, including the interim constitution. Does the First Minister accept that there is a case for a constitutional convention soon after the referendum, both to capture and retain people's enthusiasm and allay some of the concerns of others who may not welcome the yes vote that he and I will be glad to welcome?
First Minister.
Well, we laid out, as Patrick Harvie well knows, in page 560 of Scotland's Future, the process that we propose. The constitutional platform is a concept which I think has considerable merit, because what it will do is embrace the European Convention on Human Rights across the range of policy areas, not just the devolved areas at the present moment, but the full range of policy areas that an independent Scotland will have. It looks forward to putting a duty on the First Scottish Parliament to engage in exactly the same process that Patrick Harvie has outlined, and I fundamentally agree with him that the capacity for such a process to engender revivals in society and huge enthusiasm, particularly among people who felt excluded from society, it has considerable merit, and of course he and I both know there are substantial international examples of how that's taken place. And he and I will both reflect that we're encouraged on that idea as we see this process of this referendum debate taking place, and many people engaging in the political process already who hadn't previously been part of the political dialogue. That shows and augurs well for the effect that a constitutional convention and a participative process with the people will have, not just in establishing an independent Scotland, but in the fundamental revival of a people's democracy.
Drew Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm sure the First Minister would agree that progressive decisions are taken when progressive people make them, rather than simply just the result of writing things down in a constitution. But on the interim constitution, in an answer to a parliamentary question asked the Deputy First Minister last year, she said the interim arrangements will be taken forward under the auspices of the Scottish Parliament. So could he just confirm that an interim constitution bill wouldn't be introduced in this Parliament until the people have had their say in September? And would he comment on whether or not it would be appropriate for the Scottish Government simply to use its majority to pass such a bill?
First Minister.
I mean, of course it wouldn't. What we're publishing is a draft for consultation. But I mean, the answer is contained within Scotland's Future, page 560, which I know the member has read avidly and knows every word of. But when people ask for detail and then find that the answer to the question is contained within the document, then I think they should pay some attention to it. And yes, I agree with them that progressive decisions are made politically, but I don't think he and I think that the decision made by his colleagues in the Westminster Parliament last night was progressive. Indeed, it was regressive. It was a shoulder-to-shoulder regressive decision with a Conservative Party.
That ends First Minister's question time. Members who are leaving the chamber should do so quickly and quietly.